Hello again, this is Kim. We're going to get started. I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined in. And as a reminder, we're recording this session and we'll be sure to send it to everyone after the webinar. My name is Kim Beer. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, and I welcome you to February's Regional Champions webinar. I want to send my special thanks to the advocates who continue to show up every month, year after year. We cannot do the work we do without you. And for all those who are expressing interest or joining us just this month, or maybe just last month was your first webinar, we're so grateful to have you as a part of our advocacy efforts. And please, as I just want to remind everybody that all of us on this call can serve as a resource to you if you have any questions whatsoever. So I will go over today's agenda. We'll talk a little bit about who our team that comes every month prepared to help update you and encourage you to take action if you can. So today we'll give you a Capitol Hill update on the American Rescue Plan, which is a bill around COVID-19 relief. And John and Celicia will go into more details about that. We'll talk about the pending Secretary's confirmation, and many of you have answered, and we're really grateful for the feedback we received around our public policy survey. And we'll talk a little bit about 2021's foundation priorities around advocacy. Chris will go into an update around our new champions vaccine survey that we have out. So action alert that we hope you'll take action tomorrow morning. We'll be sending that action alert out, and a little update on appropriations. And of course, we'll take time for questions or suggestions. We welcome all of that. My colleagues again joining me are Celicia and John from Waxman Strategies. We're thrilled again to continue to work with them. We're so happy with their expertise and their connection to advocates across the country. So we're really, and also of course, Chris, our policy and advocacy coordinator, which of course you all know. So I think I'm sending this over to John now. So John, would you mind giving us a bit of an update from Capitol Hill?
Sure, absolutely, Kim. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being on today. It's a really busy time in Washington, and we want to give you as clear a snapshot as we can of what people here are focused on, what some of the decisions that are being made now might mean for you, for your families, for your communities, for your caregivers, and those other folks that you care about. These are real world policies with real world impacts that are being debated even as we speak. Most of that is taking the form of ongoing debate over what's been called the American Rescue Plan. This is a proposal that was put forward really less, I think, than 2 weeks after the Biden administration took office. President Biden put forward a $1.9 trillion proposal to Congress that, in the estimation of the administration, represents a comprehensive approach to addressing not only the health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but really some of the real world economic fallout of the pandemic and the different mechanisms that are needed in order to really recover from that. So hence the name of this plan being the Rescue Plan. We anticipate that this is the first of 2 major pieces of legislation that Congress is likely to take up this year. We'll talk a little bit more about the process for that, which is an unusual process. But the Rescue Plan is generally the first piece of legislation that they are sending to Congress for consideration. And then the second really large piece of legislation is likely to be more focused on recovery and infrastructure and really the Biden quote unquote Build Back Better agenda. And we expect to see that later on in the spring and into the fall. Parallel to that, as Chris will discuss, there's also the regular ongoing appropriations process that happens every year. All of this that we're going to talk about here in terms of COVID relief is parallel to and outside of that appropriations process, but that process is ongoing and is really now just getting underway. So to talk a little bit about some of the things that are in the Biden proposal, this is not a comprehensive list. The proposal that went to Congress is about 20 pages of plain text. The legislation itself is about almost 600 pages of legislative text. So, but some of the highlights, there's a major investment of dollars in the proposal and in the legislation for vaccine distribution. As folks may know, there is increasing hope around vaccine supply. It's been a real challenge so far in the early days of post-approval of the vaccines to have enough supply to get to all the groups and all the individuals who need it. There's been sort of a tiering system in place. Many folks on the call I know have been navigating that with mixed success. But the anticipation is, both from the companies who produce the vaccine and from the government, that we will see a major surge in supply of vaccine over the next several months. That includes the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, but also we are expecting to see approval of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a one-shot vaccine, as early as this weekend. And so that would make a big impact as well on people's ability to get vaccines. So one of the things the Biden administration has proposed investing in are community vaccination sites across the nation. They've already begun constructing some of those sites using FEMA authority, and also partnering with community level providers like federally qualified health centers and physicians' offices to provide vaccinations. But there's a long way to go with that, and so that's one of the major planks of this proposal. Similarly, and certainly something I think that hits home for a lot of folks, is funding to safely reopen schools. There's been a lot of debate around when it is best and most appropriate to reopen schools. This has been playing out on a state by state and community by community level. But some of the funding would be used for things like improving ventilation systems, putting in various dividers so that there's, and personal protective equipment so that there's, at least some increased level of safety for those navigating school reopenings. There's also, and tends to be the most prominent thing covered in these packages, additional stimulus checks that would be sent to individuals across the country. The baseline amount for those checks in this package would be $1,400. That follows on the $600 checks that were included in the package that was passed at the end of last year. There are some income limits to those, and so in the current proposal, at about $75,000 of income for individuals, or $150,000 of income for families, that $1,400 starts to phase out. And so you would see a smaller amount for families and individuals above that threshold. That's one of the things currently under discussion, is should there be more targeting of those checks towards those most in need. There is additional support for small businesses in this package. Obviously, small businesses have been some of the hardest hit entities due to the pandemic. There's a renewed investment in the Paycheck Protection Program, which is the main small business program that was created in the first COVID legislation last year. But there is also in this legislation a dedicated fund of $25 billion specific to restaurants to keep that industry afloat in what obviously are really challenging times. There's minimum wage proposals included in the Biden proposal. This is one thing that it's a little unclear what's going to happen with this proposal as this moves through the congressional process. But it would raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour, as well as bring parity and end the sub-minimum wage for people with disabilities hired as part of special programs. That provision around the minimum wage, we'll talk more about the process going forward, but there are a couple of different obstacles for that provision, both from a process standpoint and from a political standpoint, in terms of whether it has the necessary support to pass as part of this package. Then lastly, something we've been following pretty closely is there is additional funding for state Medicaid programs, specifically to invest in home and community-based services, or HCBS, through Medicaid. Obviously an issue of great importance to the disability community writ large. So just talking about process for this, this legislation, looking ahead, we do think that the House is likely to vote as early as tomorrow on the legislation. There have been committee hearings in 9 different committees of jurisdiction, which have different pieces of this plan under their jurisdiction. Those different 9 committee bills have been woven into one bill by the House Budget Committee. That bill is then now likely to go first, as all bills do, to the House Rules Committee, and then to the House floor for a vote tomorrow. It is expected to pass the House. It's expected, as this process has been sort of all along, to pass on what is expected to be a very party line vote, with all Democrats, or almost all Democrats, in favor, and likely all Republican members opposed. And this lines up with what the next steps are in the Senate, which is a process known as budget reconciliation. And I don't want to go too deep into all of the weeds, but I think that what we can say about the Senate process and budget reconciliation in general is it's a specialized process for passing certain legislation in the Senate. Unlike most legislation, budget reconciliation bills are not subject to the filibuster, and therefore they are not subject to the 60 vote threshold that it takes to end a filibuster and ostensibly to pass any bill that is subject to a filibuster. So in other words, a budget reconciliation bill can pass with 51 votes. That is exactly the majority that the Democrats have in the Senate. In fact, they have a 50, the Senate is currently a 50-50 split, but because the ties in the Senate are broken by the vice president, Democrats technically, with Vice President Harris's vote, have a 51-50 majority. But there are constraints on budget reconciliation bills. And the main one is all the provisions included in the bill must have a direct impact on the budget. So it has to be spending money. It has to be taking actions that will lead to the spending of money, or it needs to be tax-related provisions. Things like changing elections rules or changing different education policies that aren't budget related, those kinds of things can't be included in this kind of legislation. So what we see is a very budget-driven process, and the bill is structured in order to meet those requirements. So just in general, to remind folks, I think there's so much going on for us here in Washington that we can sort of lose track of time, but it's really only just a little over a month ago that the Biden administration took office at the inauguration. That rescue plan, as I mentioned, was submitted and made public in January. This month in February, we have seen committee markups, as I mentioned. Markup is another word for a hearing where a committee actually considers a specific piece of legislation. And then what we expect in March is the Senate vote. Depending on what happens in the Senate, the bill may need to go back to the House for a final vote, and then be submitted to the president for his signature and be made into law. Obviously, a lot of that remains to be seen, but part of that ambitious timeline is because current unemployment benefits, supplemental unemployment benefits that have been in place during much of the pandemic, the current unemployment benefits are scheduled to expire on March 14th. And so that is what was extended in the last COVID legislation. This, folks may be familiar, is what's known as pandemic emergency unemployment compensation and pandemic unemployment assistance. And this is that $300 weekly emergency federal benefits that is made and paid in addition to normal unemployment benefits for those who've lost their jobs during the pandemic. And because that is set to expire, that has provided, I think, a timeline and a deadline that Congress is working towards to try and get this entire new package passed by that point, so there's no lapse in those benefits. So that is what's taking up a lot of the time in Washington. What we will start to see next week is really the meat of this debate when it goes to the Senate. And there are a handful of possible things that could either slow down or derail this process when it goes to the Senate. So one, we talked a little bit about the budget reconciliation process. One of the things that that process really can present is unexpected hurdles. Each party is allowed to challenge provisions of the law and say, we don't think that this meets the budget reconciliation rules. We're raising an objection. And then that objection is ruled on by a little known entity called the Senate Parliamentarians Office, sort of the ultimate arbiter of Senate rules, gets to decide if things are considered in order or out of order. A lot of that work is happening now before the bill actually goes through the process. But there is the possibility that these kinds of objections, which in the Senate are called points of order, could be raised in objection to specific provisions in the bill. The other thing that could potentially pose a delay or pose a roadblock to the legislation, as I mentioned, is when you've got a 50-50 margin, every single senator's vote matters. So if there is a Democratic senator who does not like what's in the bill or wants to see something in the bill that they're not getting, they could potentially threaten to vote against the bill, at which point it would not have the support that it needs in order to pass. Or they would need to find one Republican senator to support the bill in that case. We've seen some of this dynamic already playing out with some of the nominations made by President Biden for specific positions. This week, one of those nominations for the director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, really the budget office for the whole federal government. President Biden had nominated Neera Tanden for that position, who is currently president of the Center for American Progress and a somewhat controversial figure among Senate Republicans in particular, but Senate Democratic member Joe Manchin of West Virginia has signaled he does not plan to support Neera Tanden's nomination. And so what is happening now is what we just described. They're either looking for one vote from the Republican side, or she will likely withdraw her nomination and they'll have to put someone else forward. So this is business as usual in a 50-50 Senate, but it gives each senator an extraordinary amount of influence over the process. And then I made some allusion to this earlier, but the minimum wage increase included in this bill is something that actually faces both a process challenge and may not have the necessary votes to pass the Senate. So on the process side, there is an argument, and this is expected to be ruled on as soon as today. There's an argument that that minimum wage increase does not actually directly impact the budget enough to qualify for this special kind of bill, the budget reconciliation bill. There are arguments being made on both sides of that, and the parliamentarian is expected to rule soon. But even if it's allowed to stay in the bill, there are several Democratic senators, two in particular, Senator Manchin again from West Virginia, and Senator Sinema from Arizona, who have expressed that they do not support a $15 minimum wage going forward. And so whether they are willing to vote against the entire package, I think they're waiting to see what the parliamentarian rules. But that minimum wage increase could pose a really complex challenge to the bill going forward. So this is, again, this is sort of like what's consuming all of the oxygen in Washington. There are some really positive provisions, we think, in this legislation, in particular for individuals living with paralysis in the disability community, but more broadly, for the economy and for the fight against the COVID pandemic. But that being said, it's a very large and complex bill, and so it can be very difficult to move through the process on the kind of timeline that we're expecting. But we are monitoring it, and And in parallel to this, there's actually been a number of different hearings and nominations made. And I'm going to ask Celicia, who has been paying much closer attention to watching all these hearings and sort of taking them all in, to walk us through that.
Thank you so much, John, for that overview. And thanks to all of our attendees for being with us today. So as John mentioned earlier, it's been a particularly busy week in Washington. And part of that is due to these confirmation hearings that are happening, one of which that's quite notable is the confirmation hearings for HHS Secretary, which the current nomination is for Javier Becerra. The first hearing happened this past Tuesday with the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, which lasted for a few hours, as well as the following confirmation hearing that happened yesterday with the Senate Finance Committee. And there's a couple of things that are pretty important that happen within those confirmation hearings. One of which is that Javier Becerra made sure that he consistently emphasized the importance of health equity being a priority if he were to be confirmed, and making sure that there is attention paid to all people within the country as they're trying to get access to vaccines. And we've talked about equitable vaccine distribution, and also being able to access healthcare in a particularly tumultuous time with the pandemic, as it's been challenging for people to get the care that they need. There were also a number of questions and concerns, though, for Becerra regarding whether or not he was qualified for this role as HHS secretary, in part because of his law background, previously also being, or currently being, the Attorney General for California, as opposed to a medical background, which was something that was more expected, or at least asked for from some of the senators within that hearing. On the other hand, there were a number of other senators that seemed quite happy with the accomplishments of Javier Becerra and a lot of his work in trying to expand access to healthcare. Of note, something that I want to make sure that this audience is also aware of is that, you know, in his role as the California Attorney General, he actually created a new office for disability rights. So there is definitely hope. It seems likely that he will be confirmed after they make their votes. And it seems very hopeful that he'll carry over a lot of those previous works that he's had, and the emphasis on health equity as well. Along with that, there's been a number of other hearings that's been happening this week. In fact, just this morning, there was the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee hearing for Dr. Vivek Murthy to be the Surgeon General, and for Dr. Rachel Levine to be the Assistant HHS Secretary. And that lasted for a couple of hours this morning. I was able to briefly listen to part of it. There was a number of questions also on how qualified they would be in these roles due to some of their past roles. And so for those who are not aware, Dr. Vivek Murthy also served as the Surgeon General under the Obama administration. And so they brought up some of his past works as a Surgeon General there, and some of the questions from some of those senators. There also was a hearing on public health infrastructure by the House Appropriations, Labor, HHS, and Education Subcommittee that happened yesterday as well, along with an oversight and investigations hearing by the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on how to expand the availability of COVID-19 vaccines. This has been also a hot topic that's been going on for quite a while, as a number of people in different states have expressed challenges in getting access to a COVID vaccine, even as there's been more vaccines manufactured recently. And lastly, there was a House Appropriations, Labor, HHS Education Subcommittee roundtable on the pandemic as well, that included the CDC Director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who also briefly talked about the challenges with vaccine equity or vaccine distribution as well. So these have all been really hot topics. It's been a very busy week, but we are looking forward to seeing how these confirmations go, and we'll keep everyone updated on those as well. And I know as far as vaccines and surveys too, that Kim has some information for you guys regarding recent survey results and priorities. So I'll pass it over to Kim to talk to you all about that.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Sleazy and John. While we'll continue to, of course, monitor COVID-19 relief, vaccine distribution, manufacturing, connecting with CDC, local state health departments when appropriate. We also concurrently sent out a survey, and I want to thank everybody who took part in the survey. I realize that your life may feel like it consists of a webinar or filling out a survey. So these surveys are really important to us, so I really am grateful for the feedback we received. We use this needs assessment as a guide to help us ensure that we stay on track around the issues that we take on and the focus and impact that we think the foundation can have. We've mentioned many times before that we work very closely in many different coalitions. So we'll of course continue to do that. And some of these issues that may not be directly reflected from the survey onto our priorities certainly are reflected in the work we do with coalitions. So if you have any specific questions about some of those issues, we're happy to talk more in detail about them. We will do a better job of explaining some of our work in each of the coalitions as we move throughout the year. So that's our commitment to you. So you'll see some of the initial feedback around who responded and our top ranked priorities from the survey. And it really remained very similar to the survey and needs assessment we released in or put out in 2017. So a lot of the work will look very similar to the work that we've been doing. And as many of you know, taking part in our advocacy efforts and many other organizations you're a part of, sometimes it takes many years to accomplish a goal. So we'll continue to work on some of the very same things that we were working on last year. But I wanted to let you know that we take this input very seriously. Next slide, please. So, of course, you all know, and we're so grateful for your support around advocating for the Paralysis Resource Center. We've been very proud to operate the Resource Center since 2002. And we've continued to really increase support, bipartisan support in Congress and at the administration as well. And as a result, we've been really fortunate to increase our funding. So we'll be continuing to ask for level funding in FY22 at 9.7 million. As an aside, we are in the process of securing meetings with ACL, the Administration for Community Living, the agency that oversees our grant, our cooperative grant. And we're beginning to secure meetings at the new leadership level. And we're really thrilled to be able to share our work with them as we not only continue to advocate for funding, but we'll be going into the process of reapplying for this cooperative grant. So we'll keep you posted on that. We've received a lot of feedback, both in questions and in the survey around the desire to learn more about medical research. So again, this is our commitment to you. Our hope is that we'll spend a webinar talking more in detail around the work being done at the NIH and the Department of Defense and the ways in which maybe you can also get more involved in sharing your stories with these agencies, especially as someone impacted by spinal cord injury or as a caregiver. Next slide, please. We refer often to all the coalitions we're a part of. We know your lives are mired sometimes in navigating the difficulties of all different insurance policies, including private and public payers. And we will do a better job of updating you on this work. We're very, very involved in some very detailed and focused work around ensuring we're asking Medicare to cover some certain aspects of a wheelchair, seating elevation, and standing feature. And we'll spend more time sharing more details about that work, as well as all the other coalition work we do. The final priority is really important to us, and we want to continue to work not only as a foundation leading efforts, but within these coalitions that I mentioned before, around preserving and protecting and improving accessibility policies, not only so individuals can navigate their lives better, but really because they are your civil rights. So we'll continue to monitor the work around the work that we've been doing for the last few years around the Air Carrier Access Act that really is aiming to try to improve air travel for people with disabilities. And this year, not only has the foundation taken a really closer look at this issue, last summer we did 3 webinars focused on this issue. And I hope Chris can just redirect people when he sends the follow-up information, just to remind people if you're interested in re-listening to some of those webinars around improving healthcare accessibility for people with paralysis. Of course, we're thrilled that so many people can access healthcare through telehealth appointments. And we know that that has really improved your lives, is trying to access not only talking with your doctors, but also accessing the healthcare you need. But this does not replace how difficult it continues to be for people to navigate buildings and policies, and even the lack of education of some providers around treating individuals with disabilities, not only with respect, but with the civil rights that they have. So we'll keep you updated on that priority as well. Thank you so much. And of course, we'll take questions at the end, and I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Chris, now. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Kim. So really appreciate everyone being here today. Welcome to those who are listening in, and to those who are going to listen later on. I know I've heard from some of our regional champions who couldn't make it. We appreciate you taking the time to do that. So first of all, I wanted to welcome, we've added 3 new regional champions to the team. So welcome to Kira Mantell, Sharon Kittrick, and Rebecca McTaggart. Kira's from Virginia, as is Sharon, and Rebecca from Pennsylvania. So continuing some strong support for the Regional Champions program out of both of those states. They joined us earlier this month after we had our first Regional Champion training session just 2 weeks ago. Feels like it was longer ago than that, but it's only 2 weeks ago. And now we have 46 Regional Champions in total. So we're very excited to see this program expanding and to see the enthusiasm amongst the community. And I would ask that we all continue to think of those that we know who might be a good fit for the program, and to you know, send them my contact information, send them any information that you have about the Regional Champions program, because we do anticipate doing more of these trainings throughout the year. So moving on to the next slide. As Kim mentioned, we do have a COVID-19 vaccine survey that is out now. I have a link which I can drop in the chat here briefly, and we'll also include on our follow-up email with the recording of this event. Please take some time to fill it out. Please share it with those who you think would also be interested in filling it out. These results will really help us better advocate more effectively to Congress and the administration on such an important issue. And I know that thus far, this particular survey has really caught people's attention. I don't know, Kim, if you wanted to jump in with some of the results we've gotten so far.
We will keep the survey open for an additional few days, but within the first day, 24 hours, we had over 800 respondents, and now we're well over 1,000. And we're really thrilled with that response. And we hope to have some initial analysis and data that we can share even with ACL leadership when we meet with them in March. So this data is really, and I haven't seen the initial analysis yet, but I just know that those numbers are really, really impressive. So thank you very much for filling it out and understanding this is a very important issue.
So as we look forward, just a couple of action items that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. And as John mentioned earlier, we are expecting a vote tomorrow in the House on the American Rescue Plan. We have an action alert that is going to go out to all of our advocates. So many of you here, expect to see that email urging you to send a letter to your member outlining our support for the plan, particularly some of the provisions in there with funding around home and community-based services and other, important money for healthcare needs and vaccine resources. And the Reeve Virtual Summit coming up April 27th through the 29th. Just a reminder that registration is open for that really fun event, and we will include a link to that as well in our follow-up email. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions regarding any of that. At my email, ccarson@christopherreeve.org. Forgot my email there briefly. And I'd love to field any questions. And also, if anyone still needs information about contacts at their congressional offices for their members of the House or the Senate, if I've left anyone hanging there, please shoot me a reminder email and I can get you contact information for those offices. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah.
I just checked the Q&A and it doesn't look like we have any questions, though we do have someone who is interested in becoming part of the program. So we'll definitely have Chris reach out to Michael. Thank you, Michael. And we'll just give everyone a chance if they have any additional questions. Again, I just want to share my gratitude and thanks. Hopefully, we're also welcome for any feedback or suggestions. If any topics that you may be interested in, we'll be sure to include them in future webinars.
And Kim, maybe just while we're waiting, in case anyone has any questions, I just wanted to make the point that, in this time when everything is virtual or done over Zoom or phone, it can feel really strange to think about reaching out to your member of Congress and their staff in this time. It feels strange for us. We're folks who are used to taking the metro over to Capitol Hill and going and seeing people in person. And between COVID and now some of the increased security at the Capitol, it feels like that's not going to be a possibility for maybe some time. And I just want to say that, we have been having conversations with folks and they are really open and willing and eager, frankly, to hear from constituents. I think the congressional staff and members themselves are feeling pretty isolated, and so it's actually a really good time to connect in general with members of Congress and don't be sort of like put off by the fact that if you're asking for a meeting, you might have to do a meeting over Zoom, or if you're reaching out to a staffer, you might connect with them over the phone. This is one of those cases where everybody's in the same boat, and you may have seen some of the hearings that have happened over Zoom, and they're just as clunky as any Zoom meeting that all the rest of us are on, but it shouldn't be a thing that dissuades us from reaching out. So it looks like we got a couple questions. Just reading through this. So there's a question from Zachary about what government officials can be contacted or should be contacted to advocate for COVID access when, as a person with a disability, they've struggled to be able to get vaccinated. Zachary, that's a great question. I can give a quick start, and then Kim and Chris, if you want to jump in. I think because these decisions on vaccinations and prioritization of vaccinations are being made at the state level, they are also then trickling down in some sense to local health departments. And so in terms of government officials, really starting with your local health department is probably the place to start. I know from personal experience and working with my family that can be a frustrating experience. The other place to look is there's a partnership now with the federal government and all federally qualified community health centers around the country. So you can look online and just Google Community Health Center in your area, and you'll be able to see some organizations, all of whom are playing a role in vaccinations now. But I think those are two places to start. And Kim and Chris, I'd defer to you on anywhere else, maybe other advocacy organizations or non-government folks.
This is Kim. Zach is our colleague actually at the Reeve Foundation. We're so grateful that you've joined us. And I would also recommend reaching out to your member of Congress as well. And our hope is that when we receive this data from the survey, which I think will reflect, and we're already seeing it in articles, and some states are making accommodations now to include people with disabilities in higher tiers as a result of press or as public pressure or members of Congress. So we're hoping that this data will also help, we'll bring that to ACL and to the Biden administration and also our contacts on the Hill as well. But I would first start with what John recommended and also your member of Congress.
Great. And we got a couple of questions related to home and community-based services. One question also from Zach about what will our focus and messaging be on HCBS this year. Another question, I think a more specific technical question, really good question from Kenneth about HCBS and spouses being paid caregivers for folks that live in rural areas, very rural areas. I think, Kenneth, probably we want to follow up with you and get a specific understanding of your question. It may not be something we can answer right now, but we can find an answer and some resources for you. And Kim, do you want to talk a little bit just about some of the coalition level work that you have been doing around the HCBS issue? And
Sure.
Great.
I first want to add that this is a really important topic, and I think we should spend more time going into more detail about this on the next webinar. So we'll definitely flag that as an education opportunity. But to answer your question around rural, I believe right now we're so focused on increasing the dollar amount overall. We need to follow up individually with each state. So each state has different rules about that. So we can work with you to understand what states and what rural areas, because each state has different rules around that. But I do think there's a lot of value in going not only, and also answering Zach's questions about what the focus will be going forward. And we can definitely take that on. I mean, we want to make sure that everyone understands what the program is, how it impacts you in your own state, and what do we do beyond increasing funding. So thank you for flagging that. Hope that helps.
Great. We got one other question from Christine that points out HR1 and S1 are incredibly important to level the playing field for voters, and asks a question about Congress and getting rid of the filibuster and our position there. So just for folks who may not be aware, HR1 and S1, those are names of, or numbers of bills that have been introduced by the House and Senate Democratic leadership respectively. And they're both focused on sort of a broad package of democracy reforms and voting reforms aimed at expanding access to voting and, you know, trying to sort of level the playing field, as Christine says, across different states around voting. Similarly, I think there's an overall sentiment that some members of Congress are pushing for getting rid of the legislative filibuster. In other words, that requirement that most legislation requires 60 votes in order to pass. I don't believe that the foundation itself has taken positions on either of those issues. We tend, I think, and Kim, you can speak to this, to stay pretty focused on legislation that's very focused on the community itself, but obviously they're both things that we're paying attention to and monitoring given their sort of broader impact on the process. Anything else you would add there, Kim?
No, that's exactly right. But thank you. It always makes me so happy. Everyone is so well informed. So thank you. Keep asking all these questions. Definitely. I'm just checking the chat box and the Q&A. I want to make sure that we've answered everything. I think we have. And if we've missed something, again, please reach out to Chris and we'll be sure to respond to your question or get you the resources that you need. And I think with that, I want to thank everybody for their interest and their time and their questions and your advocacy, and we'll be in touch. Please stay safe, and hopefully it's getting warmer wherever you are and the snow is melting. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.